Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. My name's Jack, and until a few months ago, I thought I had a decent life. Married for 10 years, 2 great kids, ages 7 and 5, a solid job as a contractor, just your average guy trying to keep his family afloat. But all of that came crashing down because of one night and one betrayal I never saw coming. Let me set the stage. My wife, Sarah, has always been difficult. She's beautiful, sure, but she's also sharp-tongued, controlling, and has this way of spinning any situation to make herself the victim. But I loved her, and I thought that love could carry us through the hard times. We had our arguments, what couple doesn't? But I never thought she'd step out on me, let alone with him. Her friendship with Greg started innocently enough, or so I thought. Greg's a retired NFL player who's well known in our town. He's got the charm, the fame, and the ego to match. I'd met him a few times at events Sarah dragged me to, and while I wasn't a fan of his swagger, I figured he was harmless. Turns out, I couldn't have been more wrong. It all came to light one night when Sarah said she was going out for a girls' night. Something felt off. She got all dolled up, which wasn't unusual, but the way she avoided my eyes and was practically glued to her phone set off alarm bells. I checked our shared iPad, she never logged out of her accounts, and there it was, texts between her and Greg. Not just flirty stuff, but full-on plans to meet up at his place. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. My heart was racing, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. There were messages mocking me, how I wouldn't suspect a thing, how I was too boring to notice. It was like being stabbed in the gut over and over. Against my better judgment, I drove to Greg's place. I knew it was stupid, but anger clouded every rational thought. I parked down the street, waited a few minutes, and sure enough, I saw her car in his driveway. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to get out of the truck and knock on his door. What happened next is a blur. Sarah opened the door, and the look on her face when she saw me, part shock, part guilt, told me everything. Greg was behind her, smirking like he'd won some kind of prize. That smug look is what sent me over the edge. I don't remember much of the fight itself, but I do remember the aftermath. Greg on the ground, bleeding, and Sarah screaming at me to leave. Someone must have called the cops because they showed up soon after, and I was arrested. Now, I'm sitting here trying to piece together what's left of my life. The assault charges were serious, but my lawyer argued for temporary insanity, given the circumstances. The judge was lenient, time served and probation, but the public fallout has been something else entirely. So after my court date, things got complicated. The media caught wind of the story because, surprise, Greg wasn't just some former athlete, he was a local legend. His face was on billboards, and people loved him. That made this a juicy scandal for the tabloids. At first, the coverage made me out to be some unhinged husband who couldn't handle his wife's friendships. They played up Greg's victim card, talking about his injuries, a broken jaw and some ribs for the record, and how he was trying to turn his life around after retirement. But the tide shifted when more details about Sarah and Greg's affair came out. Turns out, I wasn't the only one Greg had been involved with. A few women came forward with stories about how he'd ruined their relationships too. He had a pattern: target married women, promise them the world, and then move on when things got messy. My situation was just the latest in a long line of his conquests. But the real bombshell was Sarah. Her lies started to unravel in the most public way possible. She went on a local talk show, of all things, trying to defend herself and paint me as the villain. Jack was always paranoid, she said. He's controlling. I felt trapped. She cried on cue, saying how Greg was just a friend who understood her. It would have been convincing if her texts with Greg hadn't already leaked online. People saw the truth, how she mocked me, called me pathetic, and bragged about how Greg was better in every way. That talk show appearance backfired spectacularly. Comments flooded in, calling her a liar and worse. Meanwhile, a GoFundMe someone started for my legal fees went viral. Donations poured in, along with messages of support from people who'd been through similar betrayals. I read every message, and while it didn't erase the pain, it reminded me I wasn't alone. Sarah? She was spiraling. She tried to act like the public backlash didn't bother her, but it was obvious. She started drinking heavily, skipping work, and avoiding people. Even her closest friends distanced themselves. Greg didn't fare any better. His endorsements were dropped, and no one wanted anything to do with him after the scandal. But the hardest part for me was the kids. My son and daughter didn't understand why mommy wasn't around as much or why daddy was always sad. I fought for custody during the divorce and got it, not because I'm some saint, but because Sarah was deemed unfit. The judge cited her drinking and the unstable environment she'd created. It was a hollow victory. I never wanted my kids to grow up without their mom, but I couldn't let them stay in that chaos. As for me, I was just trying to keep my head above water. Being a single dad, dealing with the media, and trying to rebuild my life wasn't easy. But the support I got from strangers, heck, even my own parents, who I hadn't been close to in years, kept me going. What I didn't realize was that my life was about to take another unexpected turn, one that would make all the pain feel worth it. So life after the divorce wasn't exactly a fairy tale. I was exhausted all the time, juggling work, the kids, and trying to keep my head straight while every little reminder of Sarah brought back a mix of anger and sadness. But then something happened that I never saw coming. It started with a knock on my door one afternoon. A friend of mine, Mike, who owns a small rental property, had recently taken in a tenant, a Ukrainian refugee named Alina. She had fled the war with her younger brother and was struggling to settle in. Mike asked if I could lend her some furniture I wasn't using since I downsized after Sarah left. Now, I'm no charity worker, but I've always believed in helping when I can. So I brought over a few things, a table, chairs, some old toys for her brother. I wasn't expecting much of a conversation, but the moment I met Alina, I could tell there was something special about her. She was different. Calm, kind, and so grateful for even the smallest gesture. Her English was a bit shaky, but she tried so hard to express herself. We ended up talking for hours that first day, mostly about her journey to the US and her brother. I told her a little about my situation, not the messy details, just that I was newly divorced and raising 2 kids. She didn't judge or pity me, just listened. Over the next few weeks, I found myself stopping by her place more often, fixing little things or dropping off groceries. At first, I thought I was just being helpful, but it became clear that spending time with her was doing something for me too. She had this way of making me feel human again, like I wasn't just that guy from the scandal. The kids loved her, especially my daughter, who started asking when Miss Alina would visit again. Alina would teach her simple Ukrainian words and bring little gifts, a handmade bracelet, a drawing of our family. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be around someone who genuinely cared, with no hidden motives or baggage. But here's the thing, I was terrified. I didn't trust myself to get close to anyone again, let alone someone as kind and pure as Alina. I mean, what could I possibly offer her? A broken man with more baggage than an airport terminal? Still, she didn't seem to care about my flaws. One night, after the kids were asleep, she invited me over for tea. We sat on her tiny couch, and I told her everything, the affair, the fight, the court case, the fallout. I expected her to look at me differently, maybe pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she said something that stuck with me, "You're stronger than you think. A man who fights for his family is a good man, no matter how the world sees him." For the first time in a long while, I felt hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild my life. Not for Sarah, not for revenge, but for myself and my kids. After that night with Alina, something shifted in me. I didn't feel like the broken guy defined by his wife's betrayal anymore. I started focusing on what mattered, my kids, my work, and yeah, Alina. She became a steady presence in our lives, and it felt right. At first, we kept things simple. She'd come over for dinner once a week, and we'd talk about everything, her life back home, my childhood, the challenges of parenting. My son started showing her his soccer moves, and my daughter would curl up next to her during movie nights. It was the first time in months that our house felt warm again, like a family. But not everyone was thrilled about it. Word got around that I was seeing someone, and some people had opinions. A few coworkers teased me about moving on too fast. My ex-in-laws, who were surprisingly supportive during the divorce, warned me to be cautious. Even Sarah got wind of it. She showed up at my house unannounced one day, looking like she'd crawled out of a bottle. Her makeup was smeared, and she had this frantic energy that made me nervous. "So you're just replacing me," she snapped, her words slurring slightly. I didn't bite. "Sarah, you made your choices. You don't get to question mine now." She laughed bitterly. "She'll see who you really are, just like I did." That hit a nerve, but I kept my cool. The difference is, Alina knows who I am, and she doesn't run from it." Sarah stormed off, but not before muttering something about how I'd regret this. It rattled me, but Alina, as always, had a way of calming me down. "You can't build your future by looking back," she told me one night when I confessed my fears. "People will talk, but they don't live your life. You do." Her words stuck with me. I started setting boundaries with Sarah, making it clear that her antics wouldn't affect me or the kids anymore. I also pushed back against the guilt I felt for moving on. Was it fast? Maybe. But it didn't feel rushed, it felt real. And it wasn't just about Alina. The GoFundMe money had given me a little breathing room, so I decided to invest in myself. I took on fewer jobs to spend more time with my kids and even started therapy, something I'd always avoided. The sessions weren't easy. My therapist made me confront some hard truths, like how I'd let Sarah manipulate me for years and how I needed to learn to forgive, not her but myself. Meanwhile, Alina was facing her own battles. Adjusting to life in a new country wasn't easy, and she struggled with guilt about leaving her family behind. But we leaned on each other, and slowly, both of us started to heal. By the time summer rolled around, things were looking up. My kids adored Alina, my work was steady, and I felt more at peace than I had in years. But life has a funny way of testing you just when you think you've got it figured out. Just when things started to feel stable, Sarah decided to stir the pot again. One evening, I was helping my daughter with her math homework when I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Sarah's sister, Rebecca. "Jack, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but Sarah's in bad shape," Rebecca said. "She's been drinking a lot, and, well, she's saying some concerning things about you and the kids." My stomach sank. "What kind of things?" "She's claiming you're trying to turn the kids against her, that you're alienating her. She's talking about going back to court to fight for custody." I could feel the anger bubbling up, but I stayed calm. "Rebecca, you've seen what she's been like. Do you honestly think she's in any shape to take care of the kids?" Rebecca sighed. "No, but you know how Sarah is. She's stubborn, and she hates losing. I just thought you should know." I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. Sarah hadn't made much effort to see the kids since the divorce, but now she was suddenly interested? It felt like another ploy to cause chaos. That night, I vented to Alina. She listened quietly, then said something I wasn't expecting. "Maybe she's not trying to hurt you. Maybe she's trying to hold on to something, even if it's in the wrong way." I wanted to dismiss it, but deep down, I knew Alina might be right. Sarah had lost everything: her reputation, her family, even Greg, who'd reportedly moved out of state after his career collapsed. All she had left was her role as a mother, and I guessed she was clinging to that out of desperation. Still, I couldn't let her instability affect the kids. I contacted my lawyer the next day to prepare for any legal action she might take. A week later, Sarah made her move. She filed a petition to modify custody, claiming I was emotionally abusive and preventing her from having a relationship with the children. It was laughable, but I knew the court wouldn't take her claims lightly. The hearing was set for a month later, and in the meantime, I tried to keep life as normal as possible. Alina was my rock during that time. She helped with the kids, cooked meals when I was too stressed, and even came with me to a few meetings with my lawyer. The hearing itself was a roller coaster. Sarah showed up looking put together, but her demeanor was erratic. She contradicted herself multiple times, and when her drinking habits were brought up, she got defensive and emotional. The judge wasn't impressed. Not only did he deny her request, but he also ordered her to complete a rehabilitation program before she could even request supervised visitation. After the hearing, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Sarah was still the mother of my children, and seeing her unravel like this wasn't something I took lightly. But I also knew I couldn't fix her. She had to want that for herself. On the drive home, Alina reached over and took my hand. "You did everything you could. Now it's her turn to decide what kind of person she wants to be." Her words stayed with me. For the first time, I realized that I couldn't control everything, and maybe that was okay. After the custody hearing, life started to settle into something that felt like normal. Sarah didn't reach out, and I didn't hear much about her, aside from updates from Rebecca, who occasionally checked in. I focused on my kids, my work, and slowly but surely, my relationship with Alina. We weren't officially together yet, but we were getting there. She had this gentle way of pulling me out of my shell, showing me that life could be simple and joyful again. One day, we took the kids to a local fair. Rides, games, cotton candy, the whole deal. Seeing my kids laugh and run around without a care in the world made me realize how far we'd come. That night, after the kids were asleep, Alina and I sat on the back porch, sipping tea under the string lights I'd hung up. "Your kids are amazing," she said, smiling softly. "You've done a good job, Jack." I looked at her, my heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you." There was a pause, and then before I could second-guess myself, I leaned over and kissed her. It wasn't some grand movie-worthy moment, just a quiet, tender kiss that felt right. From that night on, we were a team in every sense. Alina officially moved in a few months later, and her younger brother Yuri became like an older sibling to my kids. Watching them all bond was like seeing the family I'd always wanted take shape before my eyes. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. Small-town gossip didn't die down easily, and there were whispers about me replacing Sarah or moving on too quickly. But I stopped caring what people thought. For once, I was happy, and that was enough. One day, while I was cleaning out some old boxes, I came across a photo album from the early years of my marriage to Sarah. Flipping through it was bittersweet. Memories of birthdays, vacations, moments when we were happy. I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. Instead, I packed it back into the box and tucked it away in the attic. I didn't need to dwell on the past, but I didn't need to erase it either. It was part of my story, and without it, I wouldn't be where I was now. Alina found me in the attic later, sitting on an old chest with a dusty box by my feet. "You okay?" she asked. I smiled and stood up, brushing off my jeans. "Yeah. Just closing a chapter." She wrapped her arms around me and rested her head on my shoulder. "Then let's start the next one." And that's exactly what we did. Life with Alina felt almost too good to be true, but the thing about the past is that it doesn't stay buried for long. I hadn't heard from Sarah in months, which was both a relief and a source of worry. Rebecca would text every now and then, mentioning that Sarah was still struggling but had started rehab. I didn't know whether to feel hopeful or indifferent. Then one day, as I was dropping my kids off at school, I noticed Sarah's car parked across the street. She was sitting inside, wearing sunglasses, just watching. My first instinct was to protect the kids. I hurried them into the school and went back to confront her. "What are you doing here, Sarah?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She looked up, and even behind the sunglasses, I could see she was a mess. "I just wanted to see them, Jack. I miss them." Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I used to know, the one who sang lullabies to our kids and cried happy tears at their first steps. "They're doing fine," I said, keeping my distance. "But if you want to be in their lives, you need to follow the court orders. You know that." She nodded, tears spilling over. "I'm trying, Jack. I really am. Rehab's been hard. But I'm clean now. I just want another chance." I wanted to believe her, but after everything that had happened, trust didn't come easy. "If you're serious, go back to court and prove it. Until then, you need to stay away." She didn't argue, just nodded and drove off. That night, I told Alina about the encounter. She listened, her face unreadable, and when I finished, she reached for my hand. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly. "But maybe one day when she's ready, the kids will need her too." Her words stuck with me. I didn't want to deny my kids their mother, but I also couldn't let Sarah waltz in and out of their lives whenever it suited her. A week later, I got a letter in the mail from Sarah. It wasn't dramatic, just a handwritten apology and a promise to do better. She said she was staying in rehab longer than required and would let the court decide when she could see the kids. For the first time in a long while, it felt like she was taking responsibility. But even as I tried to move forward, the shadow of everything that had happened lingered. I still found myself overthinking every decision, wondering if I was doing enough to protect my kids, if I deserved the happiness I'd found with Alina. One night, after the kids were asleep, I found Alina in the kitchen, packing lunches for the next day. Without thinking, I wrapped my arms around her and buried my face in her hair. "What's wrong?" she asked, turning to face me. I'm scared," I admitted. "Scared that everything will fall apart again." She smiled, cupping my face in her hands. "Jack, you've already survived the worst. Whatever happens next, you're not alone." It was a simple thing to say, but it meant everything. I wish I could say Sarah's promise to do better was the end of the drama, but life isn't that neat. About 2 months later, just when things were starting to feel stable again, Sarah filed a motion to regain partial custody. I wasn't surprised, but I was nervous. Rebecca had kept me updated on Sarah's progress in rehab, and it seemed like she was genuinely trying to turn her life around. Still, it was hard to shake the feeling that this was less about the kids and more about reclaiming some control. My lawyer assured me we had nothing to worry about. The kids were thriving with me and Alina, and we had plenty of evidence to show that their current living situation was in their best interest. But court battles are messy, and this one was no different. When the hearing rolled around, Sarah looked like a different person, sober, well-dressed, and composed. She spoke passionately about wanting to be a part of the kids' lives again, about how she'd completed rehab and was attending therapy. I could see the judge was impressed, and honestly, so was I. For a moment, I wondered if I'd misjudged her. Maybe this really was about the kids. But then, during cross-examination, my lawyer brought up the texts Sarah had sent during the affair, the ones where she mocked me and talked about how boring family life was. Sarah's calm facade cracked. She stammered, trying to explain them away as a low point in her life, but the damage was done. The judge ruled in my favor, though he granted Sarah supervised visitation once a month, with the condition that she continue her therapy and maintain sobriety. After the hearing, Sarah caught up with me in the hallway. "Thank you for not fighting the visitation," she said quietly. I nodded, not sure what to say. "I meant what I said in court, Jack. I'm not the same person I was. I just want a chance to make things right." I wanted to believe her, for the kids' sake if nothing else. But trust takes time, and Sarah still had a long way to go. The kids handled the supervised visits better than I expected. They were cautious around Sarah at first, but as the weeks went on, they started to open up. It was bittersweet watching them reconnect with her. Alina was my rock through it all. She never once questioned my decision to allow the visits, even though I could tell it wasn't easy for her. "She's their mother," Alina said one night as we were cleaning up after dinner. "If she's truly trying to change, they deserve to know her." Her grace and understanding amazed me. She wasn't just supporting me, she was supporting the kids, putting their needs above any insecurities she might have had. One evening, after a particularly good visit with Sarah, my daughter asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Daddy, do you still love Mommy?" I didn't know how to answer at first. "I love her as your mom," I said finally. "But sometimes, grown-ups love each other in different ways than they used to." She seemed to accept that, but it got me thinking. My love for Sarah had changed, shrunken into something distant, like the echo of a life I no longer lived. But with Alina, I was learning what real love looked like, steady, kind, and strong enough to weather any storm. A few months passed after the custody hearing, and life began to settle into a rhythm again. Sarah stuck to the terms of her supervised visits, and the kids were adjusting to having her back in small doses. I could see the confusion in their eyes sometimes, how they tried to reconcile the mom they remembered with the version of her now. She was softer, quieter, almost unrecognizable from the woman who'd once stood in our kitchen, spitting venom in a fight. It wasn't easy for me to watch, but I stayed cordial for the kids' sake. At home, things with Alina were better than ever. She was the glue holding everything together, even when I felt like the seams of my life were still frayed. She'd become the kids' constant, a loving, steady presence who made them feel safe. They adored her, and honestly, so did I. But as good as things were, there was always that nagging fear in the back of my mind. What if everything fell apart again? One evening, after we'd put the kids to bed, I found Alina sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of tea. She looked so peaceful, watching the stars, that I almost didn't want to disturb her. But when I sat down beside her, she smiled and handed me the second mug she brought out. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice soft. I sighed, staring out at the dark yard. Just thinking about how far we've come, and how much I want to keep it this way. She reached for my hand, her touch grounding me. "Jack, life doesn't give guarantees. But you've already survived the worst. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Her words comforted me, but they also scared me. I didn't want to just survive anymore. I wanted to live, to build something good and lasting. And with Alina, it felt like that was finally possible. But, as always, life had other plans. A few weeks later, I got a call from Rebecca. Sarah had relapsed. She'd been caught drinking after one of her therapy sessions and was asked to leave the program she'd been attending. Rebecca didn't mince words. "She's spiraling again, Jack. I don't know what to do." I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, even guilt. Part of me wondered if I should have seen it coming, if there was something more I could have done to keep her on track. But deep down, I knew this wasn't my burden to carry anymore. When I hung up the phone, Alina found me pacing in the kitchen. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "Sarah's drinking again," I said, running a hand through my hair. "Rebecca says it's bad." Alina hesitated, then stepped closer and put a hand on my arm. "You've done everything you can for her. She has to want to change." "I know," I said, my voice heavy. "But it's hard to just let go. She's the mother of my kids. They're going to feel this, whether they realize it or not." Alina nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "Then be there for them. Show them what stability looks like. That's the best thing you can do." She was right, of course. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into being there for my kids, helping with school projects, coaching my son's soccer team, even letting my daughter give me a makeover with glittery nail polish and butterfly clips. It was messy and exhausting, but it reminded me why I was fighting so hard to hold everything together. Sarah's situation didn't improve. Rebecca eventually called to tell me she'd been arrested for DUI. It wasn't a surprise, but it hit me harder than I expected. Part of me still held on to the hope that she'd pull through, if not for me, then for the kids. But as I sat there with Alina that night, her head resting on my shoulder, I realized something. I couldn't save Sarah. That chapter of my life was over. With Alina's support, I focused on moving forward. I finally started therapy again, this time not just to process the betrayal, but to figure out who I was outside of all the chaos. I started setting new goals for myself, learning to cook something more complicated than spaghetti, planning a family camping trip, even talking to Alina about what our future together might look like. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I caught myself watching Alina with the kids. She was laughing at something my daughter had said, her eyes bright and full of life. In that moment it hit me, for all the pain I'd gone through, I'd gained something I never thought I'd have again: hope. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But for the first time in years, it felt like it could be good. The next few months were quiet, which, for the first time in what felt like forever, was a good thing. Sarah's legal troubles had put a halt to her attempts to get more custody, and Rebecca told me she'd finally checked herself into a more intensive rehab program. I wanted to feel relief, but all I could muster was a cautious optimism. In the meantime, life with Alina felt more natural every day. She wasn't just my partner, she was becoming an anchor for our family. The kids adored her, especially my daughter, who had started calling her Mom Alina when she thought I wasn't listening. I pretended not to notice, but inside, it hit me hard. This was the kind of connection I'd always wanted for them. One weekend, we all went on a camping trip to a state park nearby. It was something I'd been wanting to do for a while, but I was nervous about how the kids would handle it. Turns out, I had nothing to worry about. My son spent hours fishing with Yuri, and my daughter was thrilled to help Alina cook over the fire. Watching them run around the campsite, laughing and carefree, made me realize how far we'd come as a family. That night, after the kids had fallen asleep in the tent, Alina and I sat by the dying fire, wrapped in a blanket. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen, scattered across the sky like a painting. "This feels like a dream," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. Alina looked at me, her eyes shining in the firelight. "A good one, I hope." "The best," I said without hesitation. She smiled and leaned her head against my shoulder. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder or brace for impact. I was just here. But of course, life has a way of reminding you that peace doesn't last forever. About a week after we got back from the trip, I got an unexpected call from Sarah. Her voice was shaky, but she sounded sober. "Jack, can we talk?" she asked. I hesitated, my stomach tightening. About what? About the kids. About everything. I wasn't sure what she was hoping to accomplish, but I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in town. When I arrived, she was already there, nervously stirring a cup of tea. She looked healthier than the last time I'd seen her, but there was still a heaviness about her. "I know I've done a lot of damage," she began, her eyes downcast. "But I want to fix things. For the kids. I know I can't undo the past, but I'm trying to be better." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. "What do you want from me, Sarah?" She looked up then, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something real in her eyes: regret, maybe even a little humility. "I want to be part of their lives again. I don't care if it's just supervised visits. I just want to prove to them, and to you, that I can be the mom they deserve." Her words caught me off guard. For all her faults, I could see she was trying. But trust wasn't something that came easily anymore. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "But this isn't about what you or I want. It's about what's best for the kids. That's the only thing that matters." She nodded, tears spilling over as she whispered, "Thank you." When I told Alina about the meeting later, she didn't say much, just listened. But I could see the worry in her eyes. "Do you think she'll change?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I hope so. For the kids' sake." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's return would complicate everything. But looking over at Alina, asleep beside me, I reminded myself of what she'd told me months ago: "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." And for the first time, I believed it. The weeks following Sarah's coffee shop meeting were a strange mix of calm and unease. She kept her word, re-enrolled in rehab, and even started attending parenting workshops. Rebecca updated me periodically, assuring me that Sarah was sticking to the plan this time. I wanted to believe it, but trust doesn't rebuild overnight, especially after everything we'd been through. The kids, thankfully, were thriving. My daughter was obsessed with a school play she'd been cast in, and my son was deep into his soccer season. Alina was a constant source of support, attending games and helping my daughter rehearse her lines. Seeing her so invested in their lives made me feel like I'd finally found what I'd been searching for: a real partner. But just as I started to think things might stay steady, the storm returned. One afternoon, I got a call from my lawyer. "Jack, you might want to sit down for this," he said, his voice grim. My heart sank. "What's going on?" "Sarah's lawyer just filed a motion for unsupervised visits. She's claiming she's completed enough therapy and parenting classes to warrant more access to the kids." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't that I wanted to keep the kids away from their mother, I didn't. But the idea of her taking them without supervision, without me knowing if she was truly stable, terrified me. "Do we have grounds to fight it?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We do," he said. "But it's going to come down to how much the judge believes she's changed. It could go either way." I hung up, my mind racing. That night, as I sat with Alina after the kids were asleep, I told her everything. "She's pushing for unsupervised visits," I said, my hands clenched around my coffee mug. "What if the court agrees? What if she slips up again and the kids get caught in the middle?" Alina reached over, placing her hand on mine. "Jack, you've done everything right. The court will see that. And if they don't, we'll deal with it together." Her calmness steadied me, but the uncertainty lingered. When the court date finally arrived, it felt like déjà vu. Sarah was there, looking polished and composed, her lawyer making a strong case for her progress. They presented evidence of her completed programs, letters from her therapist, even a glowing recommendation from her parenting coach. It was convincing, and for a moment, I wondered if she might actually win. But then my lawyer stood up, detailing the history of her behavior: the drinking, the neglect, the broken promises. He didn't paint her as a villain, but he made it clear that the kids' well-being had to come first. The judge deliberated for what felt like an eternity before delivering the ruling. Sarah would keep her supervised visits for another 6 months, after which the court would reassess. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was a relief. Sarah didn't say much as we left the courtroom, just nodded when I said goodbye. I could see the disappointment in her eyes, but I also saw something else: determination. Maybe this wasn't just about her anymore. Maybe she really was trying to be better for the kids. Life returned to normal after that, or as normal as it could be. Alina and I continued building our life together, and the kids seemed happy and secure. I even started making plans for the future: a real family vacation, a backyard renovation, maybe even a wedding down the line. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Alina leaned into me and said, "You know, I've never felt more at home than I do here with you and the kids." I smiled, wrapping my arm around her. "It's because you are home." For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And whatever came next, I knew I had the strength to face it. The months following the court's decision were steady, almost peaceful, a rarity after the chaos of the past year. Sarah stuck to her supervised visits without incident, and to her credit, she seemed to be putting in genuine effort to rebuild her relationship with the kids. It wasn't perfect, There were moments when they came home from visits quieter than usual, or when my daughter asked questions I wasn't sure how to answer, but overall, they were adjusting. Alina was my rock through it all. Her patience and understanding never wavered, even when Sarah's shadow loomed over our lives. It wasn't easy for her, I knew that. But she never let it show in front of the kids. One evening, after we'd put the kids to bed, Alina surprised me with a small box on the dining table. "What's this?" I asked, raising an eyebrow as I picked it up. "Open it," she said, her face lighting up with a nervous smile. Inside was a simple key, silver, with a small ribbon tied around it. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but soft. "We've been building this life together, but I still feel like a guest sometimes. I want to officially make this my home, if that's okay with you." I stared at the key, overwhelmed by a rush of emotions. "Alina," I said, looking up at her. "This house wouldn't be a home without you." "Of course it's okay." Her smile grew, and for a moment, everything felt right in the world. But as always, the calm didn't last long. A few weeks later, Rebecca called me, her voice frantic. "Jack, it's Sarah. She's in the hospital." My stomach dropped. "What happened?" "She relapsed again," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "She was at a bar, got into some kind of fight, and someone called the police. They brought her in for detox, but she passed out in the cell. They think it might have been alcohol poisoning." I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and guilt. No matter how much I tried to separate myself from Sarah's choices, part of me still felt responsible. Rebecca sighed on the other end of the line. "She's stable now, but Jack, I think this is it. I don't think she can keep going like this." I didn't know what to say. After everything Sarah had put me through, I should have felt relief that her self-destruction wasn't my burden anymore. But all I could think about was how this would affect the kids. When I told Alina, she listened quietly, her face unreadable. Finally, she said, "Maybe it's time to have a hard conversation with them." I nodded, knowing she was right. The next day, I sat the kids down after dinner. "I need to talk to you about Mommy," I began, choosing my words carefully. "She's been having a really hard time, and right now, she's in the hospital." My son looked confused, while my daughter's eyes filled with worry. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I hope so," I said honestly. "The doctors are helping her, and she's going to need some time to get better. But I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Mommy loves you both very much, even when she's struggling." They had questions, lots of them. I did my best to answer without overwhelming them, but it was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's condition stabilized, and she was transferred to a long-term rehab facility. Rebecca kept me updated, but I kept my distance. My focus was on the kids and making sure they felt safe and loved. Through it all, Alina was there, her quiet strength carrying me through the uncertainty. One night, as we sat on the porch, she reached for my hand. "You're a good father, Jack," she said, her voice full of warmth. "And no matter what happens with Sarah, your kids will always know how much they're loved. That's what matters." I squeezed her hand, a sense of gratitude washing over me. Life wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But sitting there with Alina, under the stars, I realized I didn't need perfect. I just needed this, a family built on love, resilience, and hope. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The months after Sarah entered long-term rehab felt like a turning point, not just for her, but for all of us. The kids adjusted to the idea of their mom being away, and although they missed her, they seemed to understand that this time was different, that she was finally trying to fix herself for real. I kept things simple, focusing on giving them a stable, happy life while Alina and I continued to build a home that felt warm and secure. Rebecca occasionally updated me on Sarah's progress. "She's doing better," she'd say, cautiously optimistic. "But it's a long road." I listened, nodded, and hoped for the best. A part of me wanted her to succeed, not for me, but for the kids. They deserved a mom who could show up for them in the way they needed. Meanwhile, life with Alina continued to evolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just stepping into the role of partner, she was becoming a mother figure to the kids in ways that felt natural and unforced. My daughter started asking her to braid her hair in the mornings, and my son insisted she be the one to watch his soccer practices. It was little things like that, quiet moments that made me realize how much she'd become a part of our family. One evening, after we'd tucked the kids into bed, I found Alina sitting at the dining table with a notebook in front of her. "What's that?" I asked, sitting down beside her. She smiled sheepishly. "I've been looking into starting a business. Something small, maybe a bakery or a cafe." I stared at her, surprised but thrilled. "That's amazing, Alina. What made you want to do this?" She shrugged, looking down at the notebook. "I've always loved baking, and it feels like the right time. I want to build something here, something that feels like mine." I reached for her hand. "Whatever you need, I'm here to help." She leaned into me, her smile soft but full of determination. "Thank you, Jack. That means more than you know." Over the next few weeks, the idea of her cafe became a family project. The kids helped brainstorm names, and Yuri offered to pitch in with the renovations once Alina found a space to lease. Watching her light up as she worked on her dream made me realize how much she'd been holding back while focusing on us. Now it was her turn to shine, and I couldn't have been prouder. But as life moved forward, there were still moments where the past crept in. One afternoon, as I was helping my son with his homework, he suddenly asked, "Daddy, do you think Mommy will live with us again someday?" The question caught me off guard. I paused, searching for the right words. "I don't know, buddy," I said finally. "Right now, Mommy is working hard to get better, and we're giving her the time she needs. But no matter what, she'll always love you." He nodded, satisfied with my answer, but the question lingered with me. What if Sarah did get better? What would that mean for our family? Later that night, I brought it up with Alina. She listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. "If she truly changes, I think the kids will want her in their lives," she said. "But that doesn't mean she'll take anything away from what we've built here. You're their constant, Jack. You always have been." Her reassurance grounded me, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that our stability might one day be tested. We decided to keep things simple, planning a small wedding with just family and close friends. When we told the kids, they were over the moon. My daughter immediately started sketching ideas for her flower girl dress, and my son announced he wanted to give a speech at the reception. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. Life wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but as I looked around at the family we'd built together, I knew one thing for certain: I was exactly where I was meant to be.